Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down the Ohio Supreme Court's decision to uphold the death sentences for serial killer Anthony Sowell. Now, this case really makes you think about a tough question. When the evidence is just completely overwhelming, how much do procedural mistakes actually matter?
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we have to understand the absolutely horrific crimes that started this whole thing. Then, we'll get into the two main legal arguments Sowell's team brought up on appeal. And finally, we'll see exactly how the Ohio Supreme Court came to its final and unanimous decision.
So before we can even begin to talk about the legal side of things, we have to confront what happened. Because what took place at 12205 Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, well, that is the grim foundation for this entire case. 11. That's the number. 11 women were murdered by Anthony Sowell. He hid their bodies right in and around his own house, turning it into a place of unimaginable horror that justifiably shocked the entire country.
You know, the whole thing unraveled with just terrifying speed back in late 2009. It all started with a single rape investigation, and that led police to discover two bodies, then another, and another. By July of 2011, a jury found him guilty on almost every single charge and recommended 11 death sentences, one for each victim, a sentence the judge agreed with and imposed.
But here's the thing. A conviction, and especially a death sentence, is almost never the end of the road. In Ohio, a capital case like this triggers an automatic appeal that goes straight to the state's highest court.
And this appeal wasn't about trying to prove he was innocent. In fact, his own lawyers basically admitted that the evidence was so strong any jury in the world would have found him guilty. No, this appeal was all about the process. It asked a really fundamental question. Was the legal journey that got him condemned to die a fair one? Was it constitutional?
All right, let's get into that first major legal challenge, and it is a big one. It all revolved around a decision the trial judge made to close the courtroom doors during a really important pretrial hearing, effectively kicking out both the public and the media.
And you know, the U.S. Constitution is crystal clear on this point. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a public trial. And that's not just some nice idea. It's there to provide transparency, to let the public see justice in action, and act as a check on the system. Justice is not supposed to happen behind closed doors.
So what we have here is a classic legal balancing act. It's a clash between two fundamental rights. On one side, you have Sowell's right to a fair trial with an impartial jury, which could be in jeopardy if the media reported on his graphic statements. But on the other side, you have the public's right to see exactly what's going on in its courtrooms.
So how does a judge even decide if it's okay to lock the doors? Well, they can't just do it on a whim. There's a really strict four-part checklist called the Waller test. The judge has to show there's a huge reason for the closure, that it's as limited as possible, that they've thought about other options, and that they've documented everything perfectly.
And this is where it gets interesting. The Ohio Supreme Court looked at what happened and said, yeah, the trial judge didn't check all four of those boxes. But, and this is a huge but, they decided it was what's called a harmless error. Why? Because the evidence against Sowell was just so massive, so undeniable, that this procedural slip-up couldn't possibly have changed the final verdict.
So, after challenging the public's right to be in the courtroom, the defense team switched gears and focused on who was in the courtroom: the jury. Their argument was that the media coverage was so intense that finding a fair and impartial jury in Cleveland was completely impossible.
And that really is the million-dollar question, right? Think about it. In a community where the Imperial Avenue murders were on the news every single night, had everyone already made up their minds before they ever heard a single witness testify?
Well, the court pointed to the numbers. During jury selection, they questioned 128 potential jurors. Out of that group, a solid 79 said they could be impartial. Only 22 were sent home because their minds were already made up. For the Supreme Court, that was pretty clear proof that, yes, a fair jury could be found.
This brings us to another really important legal idea that the court leaned on. It's a doctrine called invited error. And it's pretty simple, actually. It basically says you can't ask the judge to do something, and then later, on appeal, complain that the very thing you asked for was a mistake.
And here's the kicker. The court pointed out that Sowell's own lawyers were the ones who specifically asked for the individual jury questioning to happen in camera, which just means in private. Their reasoning was that it would help jurors be more honest. So the Supreme Court said, sorry, you can't now claim that was a constitutional error. You literally asked for it.
All right, so let's pull all these threads together and look at how the Supreme Court arrived at its final unanimous decision to uphold not just the convictions, but all 11 death sentences.
The court kept coming back to this again and again.
They said, look, even if there were some procedural bumps along the way, the evidence of his guilt was just crushing. You had the bodies of 11 women found on his property. You had the absolutely harrowing testimony from 5 women who actually survived his attacks. And their stories all matched up, describing the exact same horrific pattern, what the court called a behavioral fingerprint.
In every death penalty case, the court has to do this final balancing act. They weigh the aggravating circumstances, all the things that make the crime particularly awful, against the mitigating factors, things like the defendant's childhood or mental health. And in this case, the court said it wasn't even close. The sheer horror of the crimes just completely overwhelmed any mitigating factors his team could offer.
And so that was it. On December 8, 2016, the final word came down. The Supreme Court of Ohio affirmed every conviction and every single death sentence. Legally speaking, they determined that, despite the arguments about procedural errors, Anthony Sowell had received a trial that was, at its core, fundamentally fair.
Ultimately, this case leaves us with a really deep and pretty uncomfortable question about our entire justice system. The court's decision relies heavily on this idea of harmless error, which basically says the evidence was so strong that the legal mistakes didn't change the outcome. It forces us all to ask, where do we draw the line between a perfect process and a just result?